Subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon to everyone. We have come a long way since the September 14th, 1999 hearing in this room that I chaired on human trafficking, one in the series that continues to this day. At that particular hearing, then DRL Assistant Secretary Harold Koh called human trafficking a global plague and said that while the Clinton administration supported the objective of my bill to combat human trafficking, he testified that the existing legislative framework was sufficient and that new legislation should not focus on developing new institutions or establishing onerous new requirements, quote, unquote. No tip office, no tip report, no tip sanctions, he said. Beefed up reporting in the annual country reports on human rights practices would suffice. Secretary Koh testified that the administration strongly objected to singling out and sanctioning nations with poor records and government complicity in trafficking, but did agree on the need for alien asylum protection and enhanced criminal penalties for traffickers that was also contained in my legislation. That said, I pushed ahead in a bipartisan fashion and crafted a comprehensive piece of legislation, landmark legislation, known as the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, which just celebrated its 15th day on October 28th when it was signed into law. The power of the Trafficking in Persons report, a mainstay of the legislation, rests on its credibility. And the credibility of the report rests on its accuracy. We must get the report right. No fudging, no favors to nations based on other agendas, or we risk losing the most effective tool we have to help the more than 20 million victims of trafficking enslaved around the world. Some countries, as you know, the distinguished people at our witness table, openly credit the TIP report for their increased and effective anti-trafficking response. Over the last 14 years, now into the 15th, more than 100 countries have enacted anti-trafficking laws, and many countries have taken other steps required to significantly raise their tier rankings. And of course, Tier 1 is for those who fully meet minimum standards. Tier 2 for those who are making significant efforts to meet minimum standards, and Tier 3 for those who are not making significant efforts to meet minimum standards and indeed may be subject to sanctions. And for those between Tier 2 and 3, Congress in 2003 created a Tier 2 watch list for those who have undertaken significant anti-trafficking steps often late in the evaluation year. And just for the record, I wrote that law too. Unfortunately, this ranking has been misused to allow countries to escape accountability, a loophole we thought we closed with the Wilberforce Act, and that bill was sponsored by Howard Berman. We are holding this hearing today to focus due to well-founded concern that some of the rankings in the most recent report are inaccurate and undermine the credibility of the report. Great inflation for certain favored countries undermines accuracy and accountability, and I would respectfully submit demoralizes countries that actually made significant progress last year. The State Department heard from many House members, 161 to be exact, when it was leaked that Malaysia was last to be upgraded from Tier 3 to the Tier 2 watch list. The report justified the upgrade because Malaysia introduced but did not pass an amendment to their trafficking law and allowed a limited number of their trafficking victims to work outside of detention while keeping the rest of the victims in detention. These incomplete actions pale in comparison to the size of Malaysia's trafficking problem. Malaysia was the subject of an incisive Reuters investigative report in 2014, and without objection, I'd like to make that report a part of the record, which found that human traffickers were keeping hundreds of Rohingya refugees from Burma captive in houses in northern Malaysia, beating them, depriving them of food, and demanding a ransom from their families. At least 2 million vulnerable migrants work in the informal economy in Malaysia. NGOs on the ground tell us that the traffickers operate openly and with impunity, and that those who get in their way are killed. Only 3 traffickers were convicted in Malaysia last year. 3 in a country of more than 30 million people. And I would just note for the record, and parenthetically here, as we went through the minimum standards over the last decade and a half, we were always trying to calibrate those minimum standards because some countries like to game the system. In the very first piece of legislation, we talked about prosecutions and arrests and found that lots of prosecutions, very few convictions. Then we started looking at how long and whether or not that individual or individuals served any time in jail, incarcerated. Again, in Malaysia, only 3 traffickers were convicted last year. If that ratio were not enough or not bad enough, it also marks the 3rd year of decline for convictions in Malaysia. 3 convictions is 1/3 the number of convictions in Malaysia that they had in 2013, when Malaysia was Tier 3, and 1/7 of the convictions in 2012. Trafficking in Malaysia is getting worse, and the government's enforcement of the law was nearly non-existent, and yet Malaysia was upgraded. So what happened? Was Malaysia's upgrade in any way related to that nation's eligibility to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership? This spring, Congress approved the Trade Priorities Act of 2015, excluding Tier 3 countries from expedited consideration by the Congress, for the simple reason that Congress did not want to increase trade with countries that engage in persistent trafficking, including labor trafficking. Malaysia was disqualified until their upgrade. More than bad optics, more than flouting the will of Congress, such circumventing of accountability is disastrous for labor trafficking victims and victims of all kinds in Malaysia. Instead of demanding change before Malaysia became a major trading partner, the administration weakened our standards to give Malaysia a pass. In other words, we looked the other way to empower a slave economy. The administration also upgraded Cuba this year to the Tier 2 watch list on very flimsy justifications, namely that Cuba began sharing information with the U.S. on trafficking and that it convicted 13 traffickers 2 years ago, which is outside of the reporting period. But what has changed in Cuba for trafficking victims in the last year? Cuba legally permits the pimping of 16-year-old girls, is the top destination in the Western Hemisphere for child sex tourism, and does not criminalize labor trafficking at all. And I want to say, again, parenthetically, I read the TIP report, all these countries. The Cuba report is excellent, but it doesn't comport with the ranking. You got it right on the report, not right on the ranking. On the labor trafficking side, Cuba does not criminalize labor trafficking. Indeed, Cuban health care personnel who are sent abroad by the Castro regime to generate income for the government report being forced to work in medical missions, having their passports withheld, and their families threatened. Again, as the author of the TPVA, I can state unequivocally that the spirit and the letter of the law makes clear that trafficking rankings should not be used in the hopes of bringing about better bilateral relations, such as Cuba. Rather, better relations with Cuba should be preconditioned on real protection for Cuba's exploited and abused children and women, and recognition of labor trafficking, which again, they just don't recognize it. The bar also seems to be lowered in this year in the case of Uzbekistan, which was upgraded to the Tier 2 watch list, despite the fact that Uzbekistan's government openly and unapologetically forces its population into forced labor every year during the cotton harvest, something Ambassador Lagon previously testified at a hearing here, having similar parallels to slavery in this country, harvesting cotton before emancipation took place in the United States. In recent years, the government has shifted away from pulling young children out of school and allowed the ILO to monitor conditions, but instead of children, they conscripted adults, continuing this systematic exploitation of its population. China's premature upgrade to Tier 2 watch list in 2014, and its continued presence there in the 2015 report, also raises very serious questions. How can a country that systematically traffics its own people be anything but Tier 3? After 1 year on the Tier 3 list in 2013, China passed a law to allegedly close its 320 re-education through labor detention centers, which forced prisoners and other detainees to perform manual labor and padded the pockets of the government. The State Department upgraded China because of that reform in 2014. But now we know from the report, and I would again put in parenthetically, I chair the China Commission. We just put out our comprehensive report on China. They just simply have changed how they do business, not the fact that the Laogai system continues and is a terrible blight on the government of China. The report itself said that the government only closed several of the 320 forced labor sites and converted other reform through labor facilities into state-sponsored drug detention or custody and education centers. Again, a great deal of hype about this, very little when it came to actually changing the system. In other words, China continues to force detained citizens to perform manual labor, and yet it got the tier upgrade it was given for allegedly ending this practice. I would note and remind my colleagues that I've chaired 55 hearings on human rights in China. Sitting right where you sat years ago was 6 members, including a Tibetan, Polden Gyatso, who talked about the so-called reform through labor camps. He held up a cattle prod and said, they put it here in our groin area, and that's how they get us when we're reluctant to perform the mission, the 12 to 14 hours a day or more that they are forced to be a part of work, so-called reform through labor. That hasn't changed. It's morphed into a different but a very similar situation. And again, that was the pretext for the upgrade. Additionally, China's coercive population control policy, in combination with a cultural preference for boys, has resulted in tens of millions of women and girls missing from the population, making China a regional magnet for sex and bride trafficking as men who reach marrying age simply cannot find a wife. Just ask the Burmese, Cambodian, Vietnamese, Laotian, and North Korean women imported to meet China's demand. And let me say, and note here as well, I wrote an op-ed that was in the Washington Times yesterday. Nicholas Eberstadt did an excellent one that was contained in the Wall Street Journal. And others have spoken out. The so-called relaxation of 1 to 2 child has not changed one iota the coercive aspects of that population control program in China, with forced abortion and forced sterilization as the mainstays, and this terrible fee that they impose, fines, draconian fines, as a means of implementation. So the continuance of missing girls will continue in China, and that will lead to more sex trafficking. We've had at this committee a number of women who have been compelled to perform sex work, in other words, sex trafficking, from other nations. An estimated 90% of North Korean women seeking asylum in China have been trafficked. We've had them sit here and tell their stories, the very few lucky ones. And of course, China breaks its word to the Refugee Convention, and rather than providing them some kind of dual remedy or protection, sends them right back to North Korea at the end of their exploitation, where then they're either executed or sent to that gulag system. Consider this: China convicted 35 traffickers last year in a country of $1.3 billion. 35, not 3,500, not 35,000, 35. Thailand, by contrast, a Tier 3 country of 67 million people, had 151 convictions in 2014. Nothing, and I say again, nothing in China's deplorable record in 2014 warrants anything but a Tier 3 ranking. Thailand, by contrast, is Tier 3. China, with such a small number, piddling number of convictions, and government complicity up and down the system, is no longer a Tier 3 country. I wrote the TVPA to allow flexibility and discernment in rewarding a country for making progress over their record from the year before, and for significant, not modest or superficial changes, efforts that go to prosecutions, prevention, and protection. You know, having a 3-day conference or making something around the edges isn't what constitutes significant. Tier rankings are a tool to aid real change, not a rubber stamp for simply holding a meeting or being a major trading partner. The rankings in this 2015 report seem to be a real opportunity lost for several countries, not just for the countries we gave a pass to, but other countries where good faith efforts were made but were not sufficiently acknowledged. No country will take U.S. trafficking rankings seriously when there seems to be a wink and a nod agreement to look the other way when it suits U.S. business or other interests. Tellingly, Reuters reports that there was a lot of infighting at the State Department between the trafficking experts at the tip office, for I have the highest regard for, and the bureaus. This year, the two sides split, according to Reuters, on 17 countries that JTIP lost almost all of those conflicts. I look forward to our distinguished witnesses, but I'd like to yield to my friend and colleague, Ms. Bass, for any opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as usual, I want to thank you for your leadership on this issue and your creation of the TIP report to begin with. I want to say that I share your concerns over Malaysia and Malaysia's upgrading, and say that there might be some people that some of our colleagues that, oh, okay, good, that come and attend this session so that they can express their concerns over that. I don't, though, however, share your concerns about Cuba, and in fact, I've been impressed with the way Cuba has responded to trafficking, especially sex trafficking. And I remember years ago when it was so obvious and open and flourishing, and what I saw take place is an absolute decline in this, and the Cuban government providing a lot of education. What was happening in the early years was that girls and women from the countryside were coming to the city because there wasn't any employment. And so to discourage that, they provided a lot of education, and they actually created a soap opera on TV that was shown widely throughout the country to educate people in the countryside and ask them not to come to the city and get involved with this. So I do think that improvements have been made there, and that it's important for us to acknowledge it. In regard to doctors that go over and go to different countries, I have spoken with many of them, and one of the things that I think that we are doing that I hope we stop, especially with the change in policy toward Cuba, is to try to seduce some of the Cuban doctors that are practicing around the world from returning to Cuba, but actually to come to the United States. And when you see doctors that are providing health care in developing countries, to me it's important that they continue to do that. I also have to say that I often cringe when comparisons are made with other countries to slavery that took place in the United States, in particular because, you know, you're talking about my ancestors who I actually don't even know who they were. And when I think about our capital, our nation's capital, which was built with slave labor, what we did is that we rented, the U.S. government rented slaves from local plantations, and they built the U.S. Capitol. And there's an acknowledgement of this in the Capitol's Visitor Center. And so I think sometimes when those comparisons are made, it can minimize what actually took place in this country for over 200 years. And then in terms of the trafficking report, I'm always interested in trafficking that takes place in the United States, in particular with girls who are in the foster care system. And I'm proud to say that in my county in Los Angeles, the Sheriff's Department as well as social services got together, and our Sheriff's Department have now adopted a policy where they will not arrest girls who are caught up in trafficking, and that they will stop using the term John to refer to the child molesters, because that's actually who they are. So while we hold the world accountable, and rightfully so, I think it's important that we continue to hold our own country accountable. And I appreciate that in the TIP report, it does have a section on the United States, but I want to continue to call for our own country, and as a matter of fact, all 50 states, to adopt a policy where they will no longer arrest girls. Thank you. With that, I yield back my time.
Yield to Vice Chairman of the committee, Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your eloquent remarks as you opened up this particular hearing. To my right, to your left, is the gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Wagner. And as the ranking member was talking about putting the emphasis on what we do here in the United States, it has not only been her calling, but her passion to address that. And so I wanted to acknowledge not only her presence, but her willingness to engage on this horrific crime against, for many practical purposes, young girls, but not just young girls, young boys, as we well know, but not only here in the United States, but internationally. And so her presence here hopefully underscores the importance that all members of Congress, whether they're on this committee or not, places on this particular topic. I'm troubled by the trend that I see, and I want to be very specific in terms of what I'm looking for today from each one of you. I don't doubt the work that many of you do and the passion of which you do it. This is, some of you have been called to this, and you see it as a personal mission and not just a profession, and I thank you for that. But I am troubled by what I see is a manipulation for political purposes of the TIPS report that basically has elevated to a level beyond many of you who are seated here at that particular desk. I am troubled by the reports, not only that the chairman has mentioned, but specifically how we seem to have all the way up to Secretary Kerry and those that are just shy of his position intervening with regards to decisions on who will be included and who will not be included. So let me be very clear. Many times when we have the secretary or the undersecretary coming in to testify and things have not gone well, they say that they oversee a vast agency of hundreds, if not thousands, of different reporting supervisors and managers, and they couldn't individually weigh in on those when it comes to accountability. But yet, as we started to do the analysis with who was included and who was excluded, it appears that it goes to the very highest levels within the State Department and them weighing in on who should be on the report and who should not. That is troubling, because once you get away from those who best understand it, the decisions are political. It is beyond my comprehension, and certainly I find it extremely interesting that Malaysia would have been removed from their status during a TPP negotiation process that is still ongoing. And yet we somehow see this as being a pragmatic decision when very little on the ground appears to have changed. And either the report and our efforts to correct these terrible crimes are meaningful, or they become a political tool. And if they become a political tool, then indeed we need to do away with the agency and the very report itself, because it's nothing more than sending the wrong message that we don't take this serious. I'm here today because I take this serious. I take it very serious. My daughter at 15 years of age brought this particular subject really up close and personal when she talked about what was happening in the United States and abroad. And if we're not going to stand up and be a voice, then who will? And so I'm being direct. I expect direct answers as we go into the question and answer period, and specifically with what kinds of intervention has taken place that could potentially be perceived as political. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Sicily.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today, and also thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Bass, for calling this hearing and for being such leaders in the fight against human trafficking, and particularly both here in the United States and around the world. And to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your legislation that created the TIP report and your early leadership on this issue. The Trafficking in Persons report, which was authorized by Congress in 2000, is designed to be used as an important tool in our international diplomacy to incentivize countries to take important steps to combat human trafficking and sanction those who fall short. Since the report's inception, more than 120 countries have enacted anti-trafficking laws, and many countries have taken other steps required to significantly raise their tier rankings, citing the report as a key factor in their increased anti-trafficking response. And that is why it is my judgment that it is particularly alarming and really a shame that we're here today discussing what seems to be the obvious politicization of the report in the context of Malaysia. I do not make that statement lightly. I think that the men and women of the State Department are dedicated public servants who fight every day to promote American values abroad. But it is nearly impossible, when looking at the facts, to include anything other than the determination to move Malaysia from Tier 3 to Tier 2 watch list status is without sufficient justification and ill-advised at best. Universally, advocates on the ground and in the human trafficking community here in the United States have reported that Malaysia has made minimal progress and, in fact, has fallen in some key areas in their anti-trafficking campaign in the past year. Both the Washington Post and the New York Times editorial boards raised concerns about this year's report. Moreover, the anti-trafficking amendments that were apparently taken into account to improve Malaysia's score have still not been adopted, more than 7 months after they were used in part to justify the change in ranking. With TPP eligibility for Malaysia hinging on this determination, it certainly comes off as a political one. I hope to hear a thorough explanation today of how this determination was made and by whom, but I fear that the damage has already been done. Countries around the world, many of whom have made much more progress in their countries than the countries that we're going to be discussing today, have seen the discussion around this year's report and decided that politics is more important than their actions, and that is a regrettable consequence. So I hope to hear from our witnesses how the State Department intends to take action to restore credibility to this vitally important report and to restore our credibility around the world on the issue of anti-trafficking efforts. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Donovan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From what I've heard from my colleagues, if any of this is true, this is alarming, so I'm going to yield the rest of my time so we could hear from the witnesses. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Without objection, we're joined by Ann Wagner, and I'd like to recognize my good friend.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our witnesses for being here today to testify, many of whom are good and loyal and upstanding members of the State Department, of which I had the pleasure of serving as a United States ambassador for 4 years. I applaud your work in this area. I applaud the chairman's work, lifelong work in this area, along with Ranking Member Bass and the kind indulgence of the committee in letting me come and testify on this very important issue. And I thank you for convening this hearing to investigate the potential political interference in this year's Trafficking in Persons report. I applaud the committee's efforts to increase awareness of human trafficking, especially Chairman Smith's ongoing leadership and dedication to combating this terrible crime that affects the most vulnerable members of our society, both here in the United States of America and around the globe. On July 27th, the State Department published the 15th installment of the Trafficking in Persons report. This independent annual publication rates 188 countries on their efforts to combat human trafficking in accordance with standards outlined in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. As a former United States ambassador, I know well, very well, how the TIP report serves as an important tool for pressuring countries to take meaningful action to address human rights violations. Frankly, my very first introduction to the world of human trafficking, both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, girls, boys, men, women, all of the above, came when I served at the State Department as a U.S. ambassador and was responsible for the TIP report that came out of my mission. And thus, when I came home from my tour of duty, began to delve into to this horrific crime against humanity and the most vulnerable, mostly young girls and women in the United States of America, and worked hard with many on this committee and many throughout Congress in a bipartisan way to pass some of the most cutting-edge legislation that we've seen in many, many years on human trafficking here domestically, and pleased that the President signed into law this past May. But it is absolutely, the TIP report is key to addressing human rights violations. These recent media reports indicate that political appointees meddled in the compilation of this publication by challenging State Department human rights experts' rating recommendations for 17 politically strategic countries and inflating the assessment of 14 of these. Over the objections, I'm told, of the State Department's own experts, Malaysia and Cuba were among countries upgraded from the blacklist of worst offenders on human trafficking. Malaysia's unsubstantiated upgrade is particularly alarming because of its overt importance to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Congress has restricted TPP negotiations with countries that have the worst records in combating human trafficking. Malaysia was one of those countries. However, on the eve of July TPP negotiating round, the State Department took Malaysia off its human rights blacklist by upgrading its status from a Tier 3 to the less incriminating Tier 2 watch list rating. If it is true that the administration politicized this report, there are questions about why they chose to significantly diminish a tool that has been effective in fighting the scourge of human trafficking around the world. The United States cannot be a leader in the fight against human trafficking if we do not honestly assess the state of the problem for all countries, even our own, and most importantly, including trading partners like Malaysia. The U.S. cannot allow political interest to outweigh the safety and the freedom of the thousands of trafficked men, women, and children. We have to hold governments accountable for their actions. I welcome the continuing investigations into this year's TIP report, and I would urge the administration to remain vigilant against any attempts to circumvent the veracity of future TIP reports and the protections they provide. I thank again the chairman, the ranking member, and other members of the committee for their kind indulgence. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Kurt, any opening comments?
Thank you for coming. I like you a lot. Yield back.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Let me now introduce our very distinguished panel, beginning with Dr. Carrie Johnstone, who's the Principal Deputy Director of the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. She began serving in this role in November of 2014. Previously, she served in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor in the Office of International Religious Freedom. She also served as the Director for Russia and Central Asia at the National Security Staff of the White House, as an election officer at the U.S. Embassy in Afghanistan, and the Human Rights Officer at the U.S. Embassy in Uzbekistan. Without objection, your full resumes will be made a part of the record. Then I'd like to introduce Mr. James Caruso, who's the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. He joined the Department of State in 1995, following a 14-year career in international banking and finance. Most recently, Mr. Caruso served as the Counselor for Economic Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Indonesia. Prior to that, he served with the State Department in a variety of economic and commercial roles in the Dominican Republic, South Africa, and Australia, Thailand, and Cyprus. And finally, we'll hear from, in this panel, Mr. Alex Lee, who serves as Deputy Assistant Secretary for South America and Cuba in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. He is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service and was named to his current position in February of 2014. Mr. Lee has led the biannual U.S. delegation to the migration talks with Cuba in 2013 and 14, and was Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Interest Section in Cuba. Prior to joining the State Department, Mr. Lee was a staffer in the U.S. House of Representatives. Dr. Johnstone, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and members of this committee, for inviting us here today to talk about the 2015 Trafficking in Persons, or TIP report. It has been my honor to be associated with the TIP report and to lead the work of the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons in recent months. I also want to thank Deputy Assistant Secretary Alex Lee and Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary Jim Caruso for testifying alongside me. Producing the annual TIP report is a year-round, department-wide effort involving hundreds of staff in Washington and at U.S. embassies and consulates around the world. The final report reflects the department's best assessment of foreign government efforts to comply with the minimum standards to eliminate trafficking in persons as outlined in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or the TVPA. I know how important the issue of modern slavery is to Congress. On behalf of the entire department, I want to thank you for your commitment to this issue and, Mr. Chairman, for your authorship of this important legislation. We are thrilled that your colleagues in the Senate have recently confirmed our new Ambassador-at-Large to head the TIP office, Susan Coppage. Last week, Ambassador Coppage and the TIP office recognized the 15th anniversary of the TVPA. Over these last 15 years, we have learned that the TVPA's legal framework is what makes the TIP report such an effective tool in combating human trafficking across the globe. Since the passage of the TVPA, the TIP report has helped to draw public attention to the issue of human trafficking and prompted foreign governments to take meaningful steps to address this crime. It is often referred to as the gold standard, and I have learned during my time leading the TIP office that it truly lives up to this designation.
Not only is it one of the most effective diplomatic tools our government has for encouraging a foreign government to take action and make progress in combating modern slavery, it also gives voice to the many stakeholders working on the front lines of the problem, whether they be government officials who want to see change in their country, activists who confront the crime wherever it occurs, or professionals providing services to victims around the world. And it conveys the human face of the world's trafficking crimes to its readers. There is much to be proud of in this report. As always, the narratives and tier rankings reflect government efforts to increase prosecutions, improve protections, and enhance prevention efforts to combat modern slavery, not to the extent of human trafficking in any particular country. We saw tangible progress in many places in the world. Many governments adopted new anti-trafficking laws or improved existing laws, strengthened their law enforcement efforts to convict and punish traffickers, increased intergovernmental coordination to combat human trafficking by establishing senior-level bodies and adopting national action plans, and improved victim protection measures. Between April 2014 and March 2015, Afghanistan, Angola, Barbados, the Czech Republic, Eritrea, Sierra Leone, and Sudan all became parties to the 2000 UN TIP protocol, which we also refer to as the Palermo Protocol. Of the 188 countries and territories assessed in the 2015 TIP report, 18 countries were upgraded this year. Unfortunately, we also saw efforts fall short in the 18 countries that were downgraded. Much work remains, and all of us must continue to improve our efforts to fight this crime. We will continue to use the report to elevate human trafficking and encourage governments to implement the actions recommended in the TIP report. Secretary Kerry personally raises the issues with foreign leaders, as he recently did in both Cuba and Malaysia. Ultimately, the purpose of the report and our shared goal is to effect change. We continuously review how we can use the report ever more effectively as a lever year-round to motivate tangible progress around the world. For example, I just returned from a productive trip to Thailand, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and China, during which I urged these governments to make stronger efforts to implement the recommendations in the 2015 TIP report. I was pleased to see that every official I met with was aware of their tier designation in the TIP report. I won't claim that all of these officials fully agreed with our assessment, but the report and the minimum standards have clearly focused attention on the realities of modern slavery and the tangible steps required to combat this crime. It was also clear in each country I visited last month that officials in our embassies and consulates are regularly engaging their host governments to improve their anti-trafficking efforts and to implement the TIP report recommendations. Amidst all the important information found in the annual TIP report, one message becomes clear year after year. Human trafficking is a challenge in nearly every corner of the globe, including here in the United States. Governments all over the world, including those on Tier 1, struggle to keep up with a crime that affects millions of individuals compelled into service for sex or labor or both. We must all continuously improve our efforts to fight and end this crime. We know our work is critical. We remain committed to addressing these challenges, and we look forward to helping create a world free from modern slavery. Thank you.
Would either of you like to add? I know it's a joint statement, but please.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and members of the subcommittee. It's a privilege to testify with Dr. Carrie Johnstone, who's an acknowledged expert on this issue, has done so much to combat trafficking across the region. I echo her appreciation for inviting us here today to talk about 2015 Trafficking in Persons Report. And I want to again acknowledge the work of this committee and you, Mr. Chairman, on the importance of this report for the work we do in our embassies across the region. As Dr. Johnstone explained, producing the TIP report is a year-round department-wide effort involving all of our embassies and consulates around the world. As a Foreign Service officer, I had experience myself when I served in Thailand. I was in the border with China. I was led to a room full of garlic, a mountain of garlic, and all these young women peeling the garlic, speaking Chinese. Obviously, they didn't belong in Thailand. The credibility that we had as an embassy and as U.S. embassy employees and using tools like the TIP report help us solve problems like that. And it's one of my proudest moments to be able to deal with things like that. It truly is, the TIP report is one of the best diplomatic tools we have to ensure the governments across the region take seriously efforts to combat trafficking in persons. And where progress is insufficient, as it unfortunately is in a number of countries in East Asia and the Pacific, the recommendations of the TIP report provide guidance, concrete guidance to our embassies and consulates overseas as they carry out their diplomatic duties as the ambassador was saying. EAP and the TIP Office collaborate closely with foreign governments and international partners to combat trafficking. EAP and the TIP Office also work very closely with federal partners that provide foreign assistance to combat human trafficking, particularly the Bureau of International and Narcotics and Law Enforcement, Population, Refugees, and Migration, Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, USAID, and the Department of Labor. The TIP Office currently funds 20 projects in 14 EAP countries. I'd like to just highlight a few examples of this bilateral engagement. In the Philippines, civil society organizations are providing law enforcement with training and support to address the online commercial sexual exploitation of children. Across the Pacific Islands, we fund programs to enhance victim protection and strengthen anti-trafficking investigations and prosecutions. In Thailand, we recently collaborated with the Department of Homeland Security to embed agents in the Royal Thai Police's anti-trafficking division, and we're considering ways to replicate that model in other countries. Our approach to trafficking is not limited to just bilateral engagements. Due in part to the focus the U.S. government places on combating trafficking in the region, we're working with ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, as they come close to endorsing a convention on trafficking persons, and the State Department is planning to fund regional ASEAN projects to help meet the requirements of this convention. Year-round, even after the report is complete, U.S. officials at every level, from ambassadors down to the most junior officer, regularly engage host governments on trafficking issues. From my own experience, I know that these efforts are well integrated into our embassy's overall strategic plans as well as their daily work. And thanks largely to the effectiveness of the report's tier ranking system, we're able to urge progress. Armed with these rankings, the TIP Office, EAP, and our posts overseas will continue to be able to effectively collaborate in programs and diplomatic strategies, better combating this scourge in the future. Once again, I truly thank you, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much. Mr. Lee.
I have a short statement. Thank you, Chairman Smith and members of the committee, for the opportunity to develop and present remarks about the 2015 Trafficking in Persons report. The scourge of modern-day trafficking in persons touches every region of the globe, including that of the Western Hemisphere. And the Bureau of the Western Hemisphere Affairs takes trafficking in persons and the challenge of addressing effective solutions to it very seriously. We regularly engage with partner governments to encourage the prosecution of traffickers, provide protection to victims, and to provide programs for prevention. Our embassy personnel are on the front lines of this diplomatic engagement, whether at the senior level of our front office of our ambassadors, whether at working level with the ministries of foreign affairs, justice, or the security or public security ministries. And in addition, our embassy personnel provide the reporting that informs much of the annual Trafficking in Person report. U.S. programs that promote rule of law, good governance, citizen security, and economic prosperity throughout the Western Hemisphere seek to address the underlying factors that allow trafficking in persons to persist. For example, the Department of State funds capacity building of law enforcement and immigration officials in the region to screen and identify victims of human trafficking and to investigate and prosecute those cases. We work closely with the office to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, and partner governments to compile the most accurate information that will allow us and our partners to assess government efforts and work towards the most effective solutions. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you
Chairman.
very much for your testimony. And again, thanks to all of you for being here today. Let me just ask you, when it came to, again, in light of the Reuters report, in light of concerns that many of us have about Malaysia, China, some of us at least have strong concerns about Cuba and Uzbekistan, and even Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam has complicity in trafficking, particularly labor trafficking. Did any other concern, other than trade, such as a trade factor, in any way come into play with the administration's decision to upgrade Malaysia or Cuba or China Again, I read the report on Cuba 3 times. It's excellent. It frames it, it gets it, it captures the information based on everything else I know and other sources, and yet it doesn't warrant an upgrade. And I'm wondering, in light of the rapprochement that's occurred between Washington and Havana, was that in any way a part of this? Anyway, because I would think that the TIP report made recommendations, and perhaps, Doc, you might want to speak to that. There should be more transparency in this process. I know very often the default is to say we can't say what we recommended, but we need to know that. This is all about a gross human rights abuse that disproportionately malaffects women and children. And you know, like as I said in my opening, you know, China had 35 convictions, watch list. Thailand had 151 convictions, tier 3. Malaysia had 3 convictions, and Cuba is down in the single digits as well. You know, Thailand must feel aggrieved with the juxtaposition of these other countries that got upgrades, and there appears to be other issues that come into play. I would note parenthetically that I was never more proud, and I am a very staunch supporter of Israel and South Korea, but during the previous administration, both Israel and South Korea were designated as tier 3 countries, because that's where the evidence took the administration. And frankly, both countries and did robust things, did tremendous things. South Korea passed new laws, and certainly, you know, I met with the ambassador from Israel several times. Their reporting, their closing up of brothels, just was extraordinary, and they got off tier 3 the old-fashioned way. They earned it. But then you look at it, was there any other factor in this continuum of decision made by TIP, goes on to the assistant secretaries, the deputy, the DASs, right up to Secretary Kerry and to President Obama? And if you could, and I hope you will, if you could provide us with who made these decisions at the end of the day.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. If I may begin, at least to answer that question. This year, when we prepared the 2015 TIP report, as in previous years, it was a truly deliberative, fact-based process of discussions between our experts throughout the State Department, both at our embassies and consulates overseas, with our colleagues in regional bureaus here in Washington, and experts in the TIP office. That is the same process that we use every year. We compare and assess government's efforts against that own government's efforts the previous year against the minimum standards as outlined in the TVPA, specifically looking at those criteria and whether or not the government has indeed made significant efforts to fulfill those minimum standards. That is the process that was true for all of the countries this year when we made those decisions. Ultimately, the final tier designations are made by the Secretary of State this year, as they are every year, by the authority given to him in the TVPA. So those decisions are in fact his to make, not the TIP not the TIP office or others in the State Department.
But again,
our recommendations
Doc,
certainly
you do make a recommendation as to what the designation should be when there is a split. I mean, you've done. No one knows more about it than you, and the data calls that went out to the various embassies. They're on the ground. They know. And I think 15 years later, we are really getting it right, because every embassy I go to, and there are many, I always ask who's doing TIP here, and I'm always impressed just how seriously they take this. But again, my big question is, like with Malaysia, did the TPP play a role in that upgrade?
The Secretary himself has said publicly that TPP did not come into it. He did not consult others in the administration, nor did the White House or USTR weigh in. I have no knowledge that that came up in any other officials' discussions on this year designation for Malaysia or any other country.
How about with regards to Cuba? Again, the report is excellent in its detail. And I mean, when a country doesn't even acknowledge its forced labor, when it pimps out girls who are 16, and we know that the government runs the infrastructure for hotels and the like, and it's a very, very cruel exploitation of young girls and young boys. I'm just wondering, you know, what was your recommendation of TIP and then to the Bureau? Was it to keep it as Tier 3? Cuba?
As you yourself indicated, we don't discuss the internal deliberations and recommendations of the different parts of the State Department. There is a robust discussion in the vast majority of cases. We reach consensus at the expert level, and discussions don't go further. There are some cases that the evidence may be pointing in different directions. As you know yourself, within the minimum standards, there are 4 minimum standards and 12 indicia in the 4th one. So there are a lot of different factors we're looking at. In some cases, they all point in the same direction of either progress or lack thereof. In some cases, they're mixed, as was the case in Malaysia, that we saw increased prosecutions and investigations, but a decline in convictions. So when we do have more complicated situations like that, the discussions do go further up the chain, and ultimately the Secretary makes the decision.
But again, on this increased prosecutions, without objection, the testimony of Most Reverend the Bishop of Seattle, Alonzo, who led the Catholic Conference led a delegation to Malaysia. They make the point that despite the presence of an anti-trafficking law, the delegation learned that the government offers little or no protection or rescue to victims. And then on the very issue you just mentioned, while Malaysia has increased arrests for human traffickers, the conviction rate remains low due to the ability of the traffickers to bribe or threaten officials. That's exactly what we thought we corrected in previous iterations of the TPVA, that it's all about, it's not just how many arrests you make and then put that out as a neon light. Well, look at all these arrests. What good is it if there's no convictions and nobody does real time or have their assets seized that they've gleaned through such a nefarious enterprise? So, again, if there is a way you can tell us who made these decisions. I mean, TPP had no impact on this? Mr. Caruso, you might want to speak to that? I mean, the Senate was very robust, including my senior senator, in raising this issue, Bob Menendez. So,
I can tell you in every meeting I was ever in to discuss this, the discussions were strictly related to the fact of the trafficking in person situation in the countries involved, and that included the reports we got in from the embassy.
If I may add, also you asked about the importance of the TVPA and the criteria outlined therein in the discussions. Absolutely, they are central. And in the case of Malaysia, we did look across the 3 Ps, and as you noted, we have serious concerns about victim protection in Malaysia. That has been our #1 recommendation in the last several years in the TIP report, encouraging the government to fundamentally change how it treats trafficking victims. They have essentially been held in government shelters that essentially serve as detention facilities where the victims have neither freedom of movement nor the right to work. And that has been our top priority recommendation in the last several years because, as you point out, it is a very serious concern. The government did make significant efforts over the course of the 2015 reporting period and in the 2014 calendar year to improve that. And the amendments that were passed just after the reporting period ended do seek to fundamentally revise that system. We are cautiously optimistic that once they are implemented, they will make meaningful progress in this area. But that was the #1 priority.
I have more questions, but 2 of our members do have to leave.
Sure.
I'd like to yield to Ms. Bass and then to Mr. Meadows both.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I wanted to ask you about online trafficking, and it's certainly a growing problem, especially in the U.S. when there's like large sporting events like the Super Bowl, for example, and there was this big, huge bust on sex trafficking. Then there's sites like Backpage and Craigslist and even Facebook. And so I wanted to know what efforts within the federal government are being made to curtail this, and then also, is this an international phenomenon?
We are definitely tracking that issue, both in the United States. Our colleagues in other parts of the federal government are increasing their efforts on that in terms of law enforcement efforts to try to identify traffickers who are using online methods to find their victims. We unfortunately are also seeing that as a growing trend in some other countries. The Philippines, for example, it's an area that we have focused on. So both through our diplomatic efforts, but also our programming efforts, we're trying to get a better handle on this because it does seem to be an increasing problem around the world.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to yield to Ms. Meadows because he has to leave.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Dr. Johnstone, your testimony today, let me be clear, is that no other factor other than trafficking issues, no trade issues, no domestic policy issues have entered in the decisions to either raise or lower the status of any of these countries this year. Is that your testimony?
In all of the discussions that we had within the tip
Not
office,
asking about
as well
discussions.
as-
I'm asking about your testimony here today. Is that your testimony that it did not play a factor?
None of the discussions with respect to the recommendations that were made by my colleagues in regional bureaus or the tip office included any other factors other than trafficking itself. I cannot speak to the discussions that took place amongst
I'm not
senior
asking about
leadership.
discussions, okay? You're giving a great answer to a question I didn't ask. I'm talking about consideration. There's a difference between discussion and what is really considered in terms of the way that a decision is arrived at. And I'm just saying that the evidence wouldn't support that there was not other mitigating factors. And I want to know what your testimony is here today, because you're leading us that direction, and I want to make sure that we're clear.
The decisions on the tier rankings themselves were made by the Secretary of State. He himself has publicly said no other factors came into it. That is the full.
I'm asking for your
Total of my-
testimony. You're here today. If he was here, I'd ask him the same question, but I'm asking for your testimony.
Any of the recommendations that were made
Yes
by
or
me
no?
my colleagues?
I need to know
There-
yes or no.
There were no factors other than the TVPA criteria, to my knowledge.
Okay. Are you and Mr. Caruso, are you willing to give us your split memos or split reports and supply them to this committee as it relates to the decisions and how they came?
The State Department does not share the internal
I
deliberations.
know they don't. I said, are you willing to give them? Because that would help us illuminate the decision-making process without you having to weigh in on it personally. And do you not think that the American people have a right to know?
I believe that the question of what information we would share and what documents we're able to share is being discussed currently by.
Do you think the American people have a right to know?
I have a right to know about how we reach.
Arrive at these horrific crimes and whether we trade with them, how it would be traded. Do you think the American people have a right to know?
I think
it's an
very
easy
important-
question.
I think it's very important to the American people how we address the issue, and I think that the facts speak for themselves and the reports themselves.
All right, so will you supply the split memo to this committee?
I will have to consult with my colleagues back in the State Department what documentation we're able to provide.
Are you saying that you're prohibited? Because I don't believe you're prohibited.
I'm saying I don't have the authority to decide what documentation the State Department.
All right,
will
Mr.
share.
Caruso, are you willing to give us your split memos?
I agree with Dr. Johnstone. I'd have to go back to my bosses and
Well, you guys are, I'm sure you prepared for this hearing today, and as you were preparing for this hearing, I believe that you would anticipate that this particular question would have come up. And so when you prepared, what was the decision was made? Were you going to give that information to this committee or not, Mr. Caruso?
I never asked her.
Okay, all right. So let me ask you this. There were 17 different cases. Of the 17 cases, the initial recommendations were only adhered to, according to my information, in 3 times, 3 out of 17. That's a batting average of 175. Normally, it wouldn't put you on the Kansas City Royals with that kind of batting average. So if your recommendation was only followed and not overruled, that's the way that I view it, being overruled, by people up the line, only out of 17 times you were overruled 14 times. Would you say that that is indicative of people up the line making a decision that may not be based on those closest to the information?
That would certainly not be how I would characterize it. I do believe that the entire State Department takes the issue very seriously and our obligations.
I'm not denying that. What I'm getting at is it appears that Secretary Kerry and the Undersecretary made a decision in 6 of the 17 cases. Is that correct?
We are not discussing the internal positions that.
That's not an internal position. That's just saying how many times did they weigh in? Did they weigh in 6 times or not?
The internal discussion process in terms of which countries who weighed in on, we are considered to be the internal deliberation process. And to maintain the
Well,
credibility of the
I
report, we
appreciate
wanna-
that, but you know what it appears is that you're coming here, we're asking very specific and not difficult questions, and yet you seem to want to avoid those. Wendy Sherman, who I have a great deal of respect for, admire, weighed in on 11 countries. Is that correct?
I'm not able to comment on the internal deliberation.
Not able or not willing?
Not able.
So you're saying by statute you're not allowed to tell this committee who has oversight of this particular issue? Is that your testimony?
The way that the process goes within the State Department, we have expert level discussions within our office. And
are you willing to have us review that when we're not in a public forum with just members of both the minority and the majority looking at those split memos? Are you willing to do that?
That is certainly something that I will consult with my colleagues on.
When will you have an answer back to this committee?
As soon as we possibly can.
So within 7 days?
That should be possible, I believe.
All right, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Let me just follow up and continue my questioning, and then I'll yield to Ms. Cicilline. We do have a break. We have 5 votes on the floor. Take about 20 minutes if we all make the last one, or the first one, I should say. Just with regards to Vietnam. You know, I have a Vietnam Human Rights Act that I've gotten passed 3 times into Congress. I've been there. We know that labor trafficking is a huge problem. The first case that was prosecuted successfully was against the Vietnamese leaders from Daiwa, and that was the first conviction that was gleaned from that law. Mark Lagon from Freedom House, also our former ambassador, makes an excellent point that the upgrade of Vietnam to Tier 2 is bewildering, and points that there's an utter absence of prosecutions for labor trafficking as well as official complicity, which we know is a huge problem. And we've had hearings on just that, Vietnam's complicity with human trafficking. And I'm wondering why they even on the Chinese issue. As I said in my opening comments, the reform through labor. I'm probably the only member, along with who's ever been in a one soon after the Tiananmen Square massacre. We met 40 Tiananmen Square, or saw, we weren't allowed to talk to them, protesters who had shaved heads that looked like concentration camp victims. The Laogai has not been dismantled. It's morphed into something else, and it's still utterly repressive. And again, that was the pretext for upgrading China. My hope is that China ought to be Tier 3. Whether or not you sanction them is all up to you. There's huge discretion there. But in terms of looking at the facts on the ground, whether it be sex trafficking or labor trafficking, China is a basket case, and it's in a race to the bottom with North Korea on these issues. And yet, superpower considerations maybe were mitigating factors there. And that's what Mr. Meadows and I and so many others are trying to get at, where other issues involved, intervening issues like opening an embassy in both Havana and Washington, China being a superpower. I mean, this tip report is sacred. We've got to get it right and pull no punches, say it exactly the way it is, assign tier rankings exactly the way they ought to be, and then what you do on sanctions is all up to you, the second shoe that needs to drop, which we seem to be late in hearing from anyway when it comes to the sanctions part, which we thought would be in September. So if you could, on Vietnam, on China, and again, answer on the record, were there any intervening issues? Not whether or not it was discussed. That could be plausible deniability. We never discussed it, so we can say in front of a committee that there was never a discussion on other issues. But if the 64-ton elephant in the room, whatever that metaphor is, was the TPP, well, we have many members on both sides of the aisle, disproportionately Democrat, who feel that the system was gamed. I believe it was gamed on Malaysia. Again, if I were Thailand, looking at those conviction numbers, China, 35 convictions. Thailand, 151. Malaysia, 3. I mean, that's a cruel joke. So please, if you could address that, and as well as our distinguished DASs.
Do you have a preference for which country we take first?
Take in the order you'd like to answer.
One thing I just wanted to point out quickly, you mentioned the sanctions and waivers piece. The White House did, in fact, release that information in October. I was looking for the date, but we can get you the exact date. That wasn't indeed released already. And I think perhaps my colleague can talk about Vietnam. I'm happy to talk about China.
Okay. I think what impressed us in Vietnam were they arrested 685 suspected traffickers, prosecuted 472, and convicted 413. Most sentences range from 3 to 15 years imprisonment. More than 1,000 potential trafficking victims were identified and provided protection and integrated support to another 668. We also participate in joint investigations and rescue operations in neighboring countries. In 2012, Vietnam's anti-trafficking law expanded to specifically define and criminalize sex and labor trafficking with punishments from 2 to 20 years and 3 to 25 years imprisonment. It was also increased the number of officials who received anti-trafficking training. So all those factors weighed on the Tier 2 ranking. The part of our issue here is that the problems are horrific, as you point out. And when we're doing these rankings, it's measuring a country against itself. Because if we try measuring countries against other countries, then it gets really, really complicated, as you know, sir. So Vietnam made some progress, and even the miserable number of 3 convictions in Malaysia, yes, that was terrible. So now we're working with them to train officials on how you prosecute these cases, and they've welcomed that. We are working with them on how to get the implementing regulations right on the amendments they passed so that there can't be loopholes, which means they can't get the convictions later on. And again, getting to the bottom line, we are encouraged modestly by Malaysia's apparent effort to address this issue with seriousness. And this report and your committee's passion about it, which we point out every chance we get, that this is being watched very, very carefully, that we have to answer to a higher authority. They know. Deputy Prime Minister Zahid of Malaysia was here just a couple of weeks ago, and Secretary Kerry pointed this out to him in very short, clear words. And he promised how he would personally make sure these issues were addressed. Anyway, I wanted to really emphasize that. Maybe you want to talk about China?
Sure, I can say a few words about China, if
Please.
you would like. When I was there last week, I reinforced the serious concern that I know you share, and that Deputy Secretary Blinken, when he raised when he was in China as well. We are deeply concerned about the situation of human trafficking in China, particularly the need to take robust steps to address forced labor, including in state facilities. We raised that quite directly. We are also concerned about women and children who may be trafficking victims that are not screened and identified as trafficking victims and may in fact be arrested and ultimately either prosecuted or deported if they're not Chinese citizens for crimes that they committed as a result of being victims rather than treated as victims. We are also concerned that the government has forcibly repatriated North Koreans, as you mentioned. We continue to raise these issues both in the report and in our engagement with the government. I must say that in my conversations last week with Chinese officials, I was somewhat pleasantly surprised by their openness to share information with us, the efforts that they are taking to address particularly sex trafficking, and their joint training. Hopefully this can be a foundation that we can help them build better understanding of the crime. One of the things that I left the country with is outlined in the UN Palermo Protocol. In particular, they focus on issues in their law is more expansive than our law or than Palermo. Other horrible crimes that we just don't call human trafficking, like organ harvesting and organ trafficking, illegal adoption. We talked a lot about the issue of forced marriage and trafficking amongst those women, as you yourself mentioned, Mr. Chairman. There's plenty to be concerned about in China. We do indeed measure the government's efforts against its own efforts in previous years, which is why China remained on the Tier 2 watch list based on its efforts in previous years and what we do believe to be increasing law enforcement efforts. We have serious concerns that we will continue to raise with them, and hopefully we will make some progress in the future. I think my colleague also wanted to answer.
Reuters report this morning that India has been preventing trafficking victims and their families granted trafficking visas by the U.S. From numbers on convictions or victims identified and assisted. I'm not sure why, how they could be a Tier 2 country. I've feeling as well, but now they're even, I mean, we don't give out T visas. Honestly, we do our due diligence, and I applaud the administration claiming that it's fraudulent. So, and then Cuba too. Thank you.
If I could just mention.
Thank you, Chairman. You asked in your opening presentation whether of diplomatic relations, and I can answer categorically that it was.
And again, it was not of the decision. Whether or not it was discussed It just was, it was.
Our constructive engagement with Cubans, which was basically done tip sets of issues. And there was a distinct change on the Cuban side after they ceded to the Palermo. What happened after that was kind of an accelerated bilateral engagement that had never occurred before. And so in a sense, our understanding of prevention greatly increased. In our first video conference of tip experts at a very senior level on both countries. In March of 14th, we had a joint JTIP and WHA visit to Havana looking at what the Cuban government was doing on the ground in a way that we had never had access to. In February of 2015, Undersecretary Sewell had a meeting with the main Cuban, foreign ministry official responsible for the United States, again, to emphasize the importance of TIP in our bilateral relationship. A month later, a technical level group of Cuban TIP experts came to the United States for a series of technically focused meetings.
Mr. Lee, if you could just suspend, and we'll come right back to you as soon as we're on zero. We're out of time for voting for Mrs. Cicilline and I. So we're going to run over and vote. We'll be back in about 20 minutes, and I apologize for the interruption and for the inconvenience to all of you. Stand in recess. The subcommittee will resume its sitting, and again, I apologize for that lengthy delay. You were, Mr. Lee, still in the process of answering, if you would continue.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I was essentially kind of going through a litany of engagements, but to make the larger point that our understanding of what the Cuban government does and does not do has greatly increased in the past couple of years, and in a sense has been a beneficiary of kind of the more constructive engagement between the two governments in those areas both governments have decided to work on in a cooperative manner, of which trafficking in person is one of those. So for all of the areas that we have reported and identified in the TIP report on Cuba that we need to work on, we have established with the Cuban government, you know, a ongoing process of sharing information that allows us to make our points and also understand what they are doing and what they're not doing. And that's basically the point I wanted to make. Thank you, sir.
You know, if you could, Mr. Caruso, speak to the India issue, if you'd like, and merely touch on, you know, the T-visa report today of the Indian government being very hostile towards that, but also what do we have? I mean, some of the earlier hearings that we had in this committee were on very, very young Indian girls who were trafficked, that the police, I remember I was actually in Nigeria in between stops on a trip, and I watched an unbelievably incisive CNN report that talked about in a half hour what I had heard from a number of the witnesses from India for years about how the police were tipped off right before a brothel raid where underage girls, some as young as 10, were quickly scooted out the building so that they could not be rescued because there was an informant within the police department. And, you know, one of the things that our TIP minimum standards emphasizes is that police are part of the government, and if there's complicity by the police or prosecutors or judges or anyone else in law enforcement, that too constitutes, you know, a violation of minimum standards. So if you could speak to India, if you would, and then I'll yield to Mr. Slee.
Actually, EAP doesn't cover India, so I'm going to defer to Carrie.
So I will, in fact, speak about India. We do have serious concerns about the trafficking situation in India. We absolutely share your concern about such appalling stories that we unfortunately do hear coming out of India. The government of India does not fully comply with the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking, but it is making significant efforts to do so in our assessment. During the reporting period, the government continued to fund shelter and rehabilitation services for women and children throughout India. They trained prosecutors and judges, and upon order of the Supreme Court, several states launched searches to trace the whereabouts of thousands of lost and abandoned children, including, we believe, potential trafficking victims. The government's law enforcement progress was unclear, however, as you stated, as the government did not provide adequate disaggregated anti-trafficking data, and official complicity remained a serious concern that we share with you as well, Mr. Chairman. We continue to be troubled that victims were sometimes penalized through arrests for crimes committed as a result of being subjected to human trafficking, and that many anti-human trafficking units, which liaise with other agencies and refer victims to shelters, were not functioning. NGOs assessed that government victim care services were inconsistent and inadequate for the scale of India's trafficking problem. We therefore remain concerned about the serious human trafficking situation in India, including forced and bonded labor. On the T-visa issue that you mentioned, I also would like to say that that is a concern that we share. We are deeply concerned by the reports that some Indian nationals holding U.S. T-visas have experienced travel restrictions. As you noted, this is an important protection that the United States provides to trafficking victims, and we take that very seriously. The current status of the Indian policy, as even the Reuters story that came out today indicated, is unclear. We continue to ask the Indian government both to fully repeal the policy and give us a better understanding of what they are doing. We have engaged repeatedly both in Washington and within India through our mission at very high levels. Ambassador Susan Coppage and I will be heading there again this month in which we will definitely raise the issue of the T visa as well as these other concerns that we have about human trafficking.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again to our witnesses for your work and for your testimony today. I really want to focus my questions on Malaysia. And I've looked carefully at the 2014 TIP report, and when you compare the 2014 and 2015 TIP reports, the bulk of the recommendations that the department makes regarding Malaysia are substantially the same. For example, they both report the need to amend Malaysia's anti-trafficking law, to provide protective services to all victims, to implement procedures to identify labor trafficking victims, to offer alternatives to deportation to countries where victims would face oppression, to increase efforts to notify migrant workers of their rights, and to better cooperate with other governments in the region. And they look like the same recommendations. And so my first question really is, if the government of Malaysia had made a good faith effort to improve its anti-trafficking efforts, why did the government fulfill so few of the recommendations that were laid out in the 2014 TIP report?
If I may begin by noting that the recommendations in the TIP report generally are quite broad and long-term, and they're usually meant to help get a government, to bring a government into full compliance with the minimum standards. So they're not short-term or small, and very frequently, if you look at different countries as well, you would find that from year to year, many of the recommendations are repeated, even if there is tier movement, because there may be some progress in one area of the recommendation, but not others. So that is something that we would see in many countries.
But again, the point is that they should do some of those before they change positions on the rankings, not just...
And they may indeed be making significant efforts toward fulfilling those recommendations without completely fulfilling the recommendation, which I think we could say is the case of Malaysia in 2015. We had said, I mentioned earlier, for several years that our primary top recommendation, our biggest concern was how victims are treated in Malaysia. And with the adoption of amendments to their law, we do believe that if fully implemented, the new law would fundamentally change the victim protection system.
But to be clear, those recommendations were not adopted at the time of the issuance of the TIP report. In fact, it says specifically there were draft amendments that were made to the existing anti-trafficking law. The Cabinet approved the draft amendments and introduced them to Parliament, but Parliament had not passed the amendments at the end of the reporting period. So it seems to me the only significant difference is the creation of a pilot program for government workers to be out of detention. Is there anything in addition to that that distinguishes 2014 from 2015?
We certainly saw much increased government efforts and 4 cabinet-level meetings throughout the year in which the government did ramp up and outline significant new efforts that it was taking, including drafting this law through new consultations with civil society, which it had not done in the past. That was indeed progress in one of our top recommendations as well.
I'm very concerned because when you take these two reports and put them side by side, while it identifies actions that Malaysia should take, which I think most countries that understand to mean you should do these things or some effort in a serious way to get these things done, and if you get some of them done, you will presumably have some opportunity to move up in the rankings. They got none of them done other than this pilot program, and they had a significant change in their status. So my next question is did any staff in the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons recommend the upgrade from Tier 3 to Tier 2 watch list for Malaysia?
Well, again, we do not discuss the internal deliberations and who had which position within the State Department. It is a fact-based deliberative process, and to maintain the credibility of the process itself, we believe it's important that the expert opinions throughout the State Department are able to be expressed freely and candidly, and that the credibility of the process is really important.
So is it the normal course that the Secretary of State's recommendation, without telling you what they are, that they mirror regularly the recommendations of your office, or are departures from the recommendations of your office common? Does it happen once every 10 countries? Does it happen once a year? How frequently is the Secretary of State's determination at odds with the determination or the recommendation of the department?
As I said earlier, the decision is ultimately the Secretary's to make.
No, I know that. My question is how often is his decision different from the recommendation of the staff of your office?
In the vast majority of cases, the recommendations reach consensus at the working level between the TIP office and the regional bureaus and our colleagues at our embassies and consulates around the world.
So you say this determination is fact-based, and obviously you can't tell us what was in the secretary's head, but the facts that you rely on to make the recommendation is that one difference of circumstances, this pilot program
as well as the activity of the government throughout the year in consulting with civil society and drafting the amendments.
So on April 17th, the U.S. ambassador to Malaysia, Joseph Yan, said that Malaysia needed to show greater political will in prosecuting human traffickers and protecting their victims if the country hoped to improve its Tier 3 ranking. Given that the 2015 TIP report covers government efforts undertaken from April 1st, 2014 through March 31st, 2015, meaning that all actions referenced in the report had already occurred before Ambassador Yan's comments, can you explain why the department disagreed with the ambassador's assessment?
Again, we're not free to discuss the internal deliberations and who had which position. The ambassador did indeed convey accurately the concerns that the entire department had, including the secretary, about human trafficking in Malaysia and that the government needed to do more. Ultimately, the Tier 2 watch list assessment makes it very clear that the government still has a lot of work to do. It is far from a good grade. It's equivalent of a D-. It indicates, in fact, that they still have a lot of work to do, and we do have serious concerns that are shared throughout.
But Dr. Johnstone, the fact is the ambassador who's there on the ground makes this determination, says very clearly that they have much more work to do before they can improve its ranking. Your either recommendation or the Secretary of State's determination is contrary to that. I'm wondering if you have a basis for why it is that either you concluded as a recommendation or the Secretary concluded that the ambassador was wrong. Because you can't both be right. It can't be Ambassador Yan is right and Secretary Kerry's right.
I wouldn't characterize his quote as saying that Ambassador Yoon made a recommendation on the tier ranking within that quote as well.
No, but he did say that before they could move to Tier 3, they had to demonstrate greater political will in prosecuting human trafficking and protecting their victims if they hoped to improve to a Tier 3 rank from a Tier 3 ranking.
And we did see increased prosecutions and investigations. Of course, we're very concerned that we didn't see progress, in fact, saw a decline in the convictions.
In addition, Ambassador Young noted that there had been a failure to engage in sufficient prosecutions of perpetrators of trafficking, and although the TIP report notes an increase in prosecutions, it also notes that there were only 3 trafficking convictions. That's a decline of 2/3 from last year's report, and it also notes that the government, quote, the government did not report any investigations, prosecutions, or convictions of government officials complicit in trafficking, despite evidence that some government officials facilitated migrant smuggling. Do you believe, again, that those facts represent a good faith effort to prosecute traffickers?
We very much share the concern that you just voiced about the low number of convictions, and we have said that both publicly and privately. When I was just in Malaysia last month, we made that point very clearly and indicated that we anticipate significant progress as we're making the decisions for the 2016 report.
With all due respect, that's comforting to hear, but in the face of an upgrade, it sort of raises the question of why it is that a country would receive an upgrade with very little, in fact, other than that pilot program. I don't see evidence. And I just want to ask you, finally, Tenanganita, which is a Malaysian NGO that helps trafficking victims, claims that police have known about the North Malaysian trafficking trail and the existence of human trafficking camps for many, many years. And in fact, the organization says that migrants have been reporting about the camps since 2007 and that no police action was taken when reports were made about the camps. Can you tell me, Dr. Johnstone, whether any officials at Tenanganita were interviewed during the compilation of the TIP report? And does the State Department agree or disagree with those allegations? And if so, why?
We do maintain a relationship both through our embassy and our office here with Tenanganita. I met with them myself as well in Malaysia last month. Their information definitely is something that we take into account when we're compiling the report. We noted in the report and subsequently in our meetings with government officials the serious concern that we take about the allegations of trafficking in those areas and the camps and forced mass graves that were found. We understand that there is an ongoing investigation that has produced a report that's now with the Attorney General. We stress the importance of accountability for everyone who is responsible for any human trafficking in those places, including government officials.
So you don't disagree with the allegations that were made by that NGO?
It is definitely a serious issue that we have raised with the government, yes.
So let me just ask as a final question. You said that this is a fact-based deliberative process. Can you tell me specifically what facts you relied upon to raise Malaysia's standing in the TIP report?
The facts that are outlined in the report itself, the ones that we just discussed, including the increase of prosecutions and investigations, noting that it is a mixed picture, that declining convictions are still a cause of concern, the government efforts that were made to reform the victim protection system during the reporting period, which was our top recommendation for the last several years.
So no investigation or prosecutions of government officials, correct?
There have been investigations of government officials. We don't have the prosecutions or conviction.
No prosecution of government officials, despite evidence of complicity of government officials. No, a decline in overall prosecutions by 2/3. No enactment of any anti-trafficking laws, but some expectation they will, and the pilot program. Those are the facts. Have I missed any important ones?
I believe that you maybe misspoke about the prosecutions. The prosecution investigations did increase. The convictions decreased.
Convictions.
So the law enforcement picture was actually a mixed one. There were increases in both prosecutions and investigations.
But a significant decline, and I think it was 3 convictions.
3 from 9. So
But
it was still
9 wasn't
It's
satisfactory.
woefully inadequate. We completely agree with you on that.
I'll just, before I yield back, Mr. Chairman, this raises very serious concerns to me. I consider this report to be sacred and a very powerful international diplomatic tool. And I think the context in which this decision was made about Malaysia and the woeful lack of evidence to support it in the context of a trade agreement is something which will do permanent damage to this process. And I'm disappointed, frankly, that nothing in this hearing has disabused me of that conclusion. And for all the men and women who put so much work into this and for the mission it is designed to support, this is a very disappointing occurrence. And with that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cicilline. I will, without objection, go in a moment to Brad Sherman. But just so I'm absolutely clear, no ambiguity whatsoever, because like Ms. Cicilline, I've read everything I could possibly get my hands on regarding Malaysia. And I just want to have it established beyond any reasonable doubt that no other factor like trade when it comes to Malaysia, opening an embassy when it comes to and new relationship with Cuba, or superpower relations and geopolitical considerations when it comes to China was involved. It was all exclusively on human trafficking, nothing but trafficking, that the decision for each of the designations was made. Is that true? Is that your testimony?
As I said earlier, the decisions about the tier designations are made by the Secretary of State. I was not part of the final discussions and the decision-making that he made. To my knowledge, certainly at the level of the people that you have here today, all of our colleagues in the regional bureaus and our embassies and posts around the world and within the TIP office, all of our discussions about the factors and criteria were specifically looking at the TVPA criteria, the minimum standards there, and trafficking.
And
my
would
knowledge,
you
other
disagree with the
factors.
Secretary on any of these designations?
Again, on internal deliberation process, we don't discuss that publicly, sort of who took which position when. And so that we can protect the credibility of the process, there are robust discussions, as there are on any policy issues. People have different perspectives on things. Ultimately, the Secretary has to take into account views and perspectives and the expertise of others. And if I may, I would also like to address what I think is a misperception of some of our regional bureau colleagues in our embassies and missions and perhaps others in the State Department who also bring expertise. It is not only the TIP office that are experts on the trafficking situation, the situation in their countries, but the discussions that we have with them inform both the tier designations, but even more importantly, the report. It could not be as factual and as accurate and as objective as it is without the expertise and knowledge.
Again, as I said earlier, I thought your reporting on Cuba was excellent, as well as some of the other countries where there's a dispute, but the designation didn't match, in my opinion, the findings. And again, just to put an exclamation point behind it, Malaysia had 3 convictions. China had 35, and yet they are not a Tier 3 country as they ought to be. And Thailand had 151 convictions. And again, it's not the only minimum standard, but it is a very, very important one 151 convictions in Thailand, and they remain Tier 3. If I was in the Thai embassy, I would say, what gives here? That's very, very discouraging. I think they ought to be Tier 3, but the others ought to be Tier 3 as well. Mark Lagon makes an important number of important observations. One of them is about Uzbekistan. He notes that the report notes that child labor mobilization continued in some districts, and he points out that the government-compelled forced labor of adults remained endemic in the 2014 cotton harvest, and asks the $64 question: how can a state-run trafficking earn anything but a Tier 3 ranking? What alleged U.S. strategic interest could motivate even a purely cynical upgrade?
So on Uzbekistan, this is a country near and dear to my heart. As you mentioned in the beginning, I served as a human rights officer there. And while I was there, actually, I was asked by the embassy to focus on trafficking in persons, as it was an issue that was of growing concern to the department and the administration, even then in 2003 when I served there. The issue of forced labor, particularly child labor as well as adult labor, are of great concern to the department. We have, over the years and in various roles that I have been in personally, also engaged on this with the Uzbekistan government in close collaboration with our NGO partners as well, who provide vital information in very difficult circumstances. It is definitely an issue that we remain very concerned about. And again, I would point out that Uzbekistan was upgraded only to Tier 2 watch list. That does indicate they are not meeting the minimum standards. They have a long way to go to improve their efforts on combating human trafficking. However, we do believe and did assess that in 2014, they did make significant efforts to dramatically reduce the use of forced child labor. We share your concerns about adult forced labor, both in the cotton harvest and other sectors.
Okay, without objection, and I mentioned this earlier, I believe, but if not, I'm doing it now. Very incisive articles by Reuters reporters Jason Zepp and Matt Spedalnik will be made a part of the record, and also a series of reports of commercial fishing, slavery in Papua New Guinea and Malaysia by Robin McDowell and Martha Mendoza from the Associated Press. Without objection, I'd like to make those a part of the record as well. Without objection, too, I yield to my good friend and colleague for any comments you might have or questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Johnson, you have an outstanding reputation. If you'd actually tell us something, I would believe it. If you're just going to tell us that the decision was made by Secretary Kerry, you're not qualified to psychoanalyze him. If he made the decision, we ought to have him here and ask him. Because we ask you what your opinion is, and you won't tell us. But let me go at this a different way. I tend to believe what Reuters reports. Pretty accurate service, more accurate than most. They report that Malaysia, Cuba, and China all got better ratings than your office wanted to give them. Can you give me any reason to disbelieve Reuters?
Well, I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate that human trafficking is an issue that not only the TIP office cares about, but our colleagues throughout the State Department.
I know.
And
Let's put it, it's quite possible your office could make a mistake. It's quite possible you'd want to give some country a Tier 1, and due to factors that arguments made by others in the State Department, they get a Tier 2. It's possible you'd give them a Tier 2, and for other reasons outside your office, they're given a Tier 3, and all of a sudden our trade negotiations blow up. That's possible. Didn't happen in this lifetime, but it's possible. But I'm asking about your office. And I've got a report here from Reuters that says your office wanted to give a lower rating to Malaysia, Cuba, and China than they ultimately got. Can you give me a reason to disbelieve Reuters?
I would reiterate that, again, the narratives themselves are accurate and objective, and the product of...
Okay. You could just say, no, you're not going to give me a reason to disbelieve Reuters, because telling me that you do a great job and that the other offices of the State Department do a great job is not answering. It's just telling me what, of course, the State Department believes, which is every office is doing a great job. can you give me a reason to disbelieve Reuters' report about what your office recommended?
I believe that the process through which we came to both the tier determinations themselves, as well as the reports, was very much improved by the deliberative process and the robust discussions and debates within the department. Of course, people will have different perspectives. That's natural for any.
Okay, so that's not a reason to disbelieve Reuters. That's just a reason to say maybe Reuters was right and your office recommended a lower, and maybe but maybe the upgrade was justified. But you're not telling me in your answer that there wasn't an upgrade from the position of your office. You're just telling me that there are other brilliant people at the State Department and they may have a good point. Is that the point you're making, or are I'll stipulate, other folks in the State Department are brilliant, they have input, they may have good reason, and it could very well be that the upgrade is called for, an upgrade beyond what your department or office would recommend. But I'm just asking about your office. Can you give me any reason to disbelieve the sentence I quoted from Reuters?
Again,
Okay, we'll go on. We'll go on. Do you personally believe that Thailand deserves a worse grading than Malaysia? Your personal belief? Or do you simply choose not to give your personal belief?
I am here representing the State Department, so I.
Could you give us your personal belief?
The department's views on that, Thailand's rating.
I didn't ask for the department's views. If you refuse to give me your personal views, just say you refuse, and we'll go on to the next question.
If I could comment, I think that implicit in your question is maybe a misperception as well, that I think the Reuters article also casts this as a winning and losing, and that the tip office lost more often this year. And I don't think that's how we see it.
You're answering a question this is strange. You won't answer the questions I do ask, and you are answering the questions I don't ask. I realize that your department has got to fight with, argue with, or at least discuss things with other, I mean office, not department, with other bureaus and offices around the State Department. I'm not asking what is the State Department's view. I got that in writing. I'm asking what your view is and what your department's view is, and you won't tell us. And the fact that Secretary Kerry would send you here without instructing you or authorizing you to tell us what really happened gives me all the information I need. I've got a Reuters report that Secretary Kerry and the State Department is unwilling to deny. Now, I'm not a good enough lawyer to get you to admit it. You don't have to answer a question. But Reuters reports that that your office wanted to give a lower grade, lower tier than these three countries ultimately got. You're not saying that is not the case. You are saying that the State Department is a brilliant organization with lots of brilliant people. Wouldn't want you to say anything else. If the State Department can't deny this Reuters report, then I think we know who controls the ultimate decisions, and that is those who want this trade deal. I think this report is an important part of our human rights efforts. I don't think it's totally discredited. I think that it can be relied upon, except when there are major diplomatic or economic reasons to go another way. And for 80, 90% of the countries, there is no other reason. There is no strong other reason to go another way. But can you mention any respected human rights organization that says Malaysia is entitled to be treated as given a higher grade than Thailand? You know them all. You work with them all. We've got another one of them coming for the second panel. But you know, that's just one. He can only invite one. You probably, if I asked you, could identify 40 organizations, some very well known, some very well respected, some less so. Can you name anybody who doesn't get a paycheck from the State Department, who's involved in human rights, who says that Malaysia deserves to be in a higher tier than Thailand?
There are indeed a variety of opinions on Malaysia, which we did take.
Can you you know them all? Can you name one?
All I can say is that we have consulted with NGOs. We certainly take their views and information. They're very important.
And every NGO I'm aware of, and you know a lot more than I do, every NGO I'm aware of says that that Malaysia is not entitled to be in a higher tier than Thailand. And so I go to you, the expert, and I say, hey, there may be some organizations I haven't talked to or even heard of. And I ask you to name just one that thinks, you know, even if the community was 39-1 against the position this report takes, at least there'd be one. And you know the top 40. Is there one that agrees with the report's decision to put Thailand in a lower category than Malaysia?
As I said, there are a variety of opinions on human trafficking situation in Malaysia as there are on Thailand. There's serious problems in both countries. The Tier 2 watch list ranking indicates very clearly that Malaysia still has a long way to go and there are still serious problems.
That's a nice answer, but you didn't name one. You didn't name one because there isn't one. If you knew one, you'd tell me, wouldn't you?
At the end of the day, the tier ranking is the decision that the Secretary of State makes.
And that's why it's the Secretary of State who ought to have the whatevers to come before Congress and defend this decision, because it puts you in a terrible position. The Secretary made these decisions. Only he can indicate why he made them. You don't know why he made them. I know why you don't call me as a witness, but if I was called as a witness, I would say he made them because he wants TPP to go forward and is willing to throw the Trafficking in Persons report out the window. But I'm not testifying to that because I'm sitting up here. You haven't asked me to sit down there. Look, you work very hard. This is not, for those of us who think that your work is very important, this is a difficult situation. I respect your personal integrity. You have been put in a very difficult position. You've done as good a job as anyone could possibly do in justifying one of the worst decisions made by the department this year. And you didn't make it. I will yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sherman. And anytime you want to testify, you're more than welcome. Thank you again.
I fear some of my colleagues would be as tough on me as I am on so many witnesses. They've seen it. I don't have anything good. I don't have enough in the karma bank to put myself through that. Thank you.
Thank you. I do want to thank our distinguished witnesses for your testimony. As you can see, there is a great deal of bipartisan concern here on particularly these countries in question. And I would like, without objection, put a letter that was sent to Secretary Kerry from the Cotton Campaign, which lays out their very specific concerns about the ranking of Uzbekistan in this year's TIP report. Thank you again for your testimony, and we look forward to working with you going forward.
Thank you. Likewise, we look forward to working with you, and thank you for your commitment to this issue.
Thank you, Dr. Johnstone. I'd like to now welcome our second panel, which is Ambassador Mark Lagon, who is our third ambassador at large for human trafficking and the director of the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons at the U.S. Department of State. Ambassador Lagon's record of involvement in human rights is long and diverse, spanning from Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of International Organization Affairs, with responsibility for human rights, humanitarian issues, and UN reform, through academia, where he was the chair for global politics and security at Georgetown University's Master of Science in Foreign Service program, an adjunct a senior fellow for human rights at the Council on Foreign Relations. He was also executive director and CEO of the anti-human trafficking nonprofit Polaris, and currently serves as the president of Freedom House. Ambassador Legon, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, I am very pleased that you and the members of the subcommittee have invited me to testify on the TIP report, as I've had occasion to do in the past. I'd like to look at some of the key issues in the report. Of course, we're here to focus on specific countries, but it is worth remembering that while getting less attention, the report each year highlights themes as well, with the text that precedes the country narratives. And this year's report highlights some very interesting and important things: global supply chains, and in particular offering cues to the private sector to fight the problem of human trafficking. The report highlights harmful cultural norms and hence doesn't succumb to cultural relativism, although I will note that the report would have done well to note a cultural tolerance for wide-scale sex buying in Latin America, Europe, Southeast Asia, Japan, as a driver of sex trafficking. And I commend the report for highlighting alternatives to testimony drawn from traumatized trafficking survivors as the means of evidence to hold tormentors to account, because all too often relying on testimony of the victims solely propels law enforcement in countries around the world to leverage the properly unconditional protection services to elicit cooperation. Most important, I'd want to highlight in the global findings in the report some percentages. I pulled out my calculator, as I do every year, to look at a chart on page 48 of the report. We see a 23.1% drop in convictions worldwide, and that was from an already modest 5,700 convictions the previous year. Prosecutions for labor, as opposed to sex trafficking, dropped from an already low 12.7% to 4.2%, and the convictions went from a low 8.1% the previous year to only 4.9% of convictions for human trafficking being for labor. So there is, in essence, global impunity for labor trafficking. With respect to country situations, many of which you've already raised, and I am happy that you even cited some things already in my testimony. China, in the view of Freedom House, is the largest governance problem in the world, both in terms of its internal treatment of human rights and as a pernicious model. Freedom House, of course, ranks China as not free in its own reports. Both the intrusive actions and its sins of omission are important in the human trafficking area. Intrusive actions of the state fuel trafficking, including decades-long population policies that have created a shortage of females, both as spouses and sexual partners. And I really want to highlight the report this year, which says, quote, "The government converted some reform through labor facilities into different types of detention centers that continued to employ forced labor." What the Chinese state neglects to do also matters in terms of human trafficking, and very importantly, the report calls for China to provide legal alternatives to foreign victims' removal to countries where they'd face hardship or retribution. Read North Korea. Heinous punishment to people who would be returned to North Korea, which causes a human trafficking problem in China. There is a terrible arbitrary rule by law pattern as opposed to rule of law pattern in China, and that is manifest in the failure to adopt legislation on all forms of human trafficking. Malaysia, much of the focus of your discussion today and a major controversy. Well, Freedom House ranks Malaysia as partly free. And I will say, for my own part, I have endorsed the Trans-Pacific Partnership because, generally speaking, I think open rules and norms put the right pressure on illiberal regimes. But the upgrade seems quite clear to coincide with the desires of the Department of State to make Malaysia eligible for the TPP and not the merits. For instance, corruption is rampant. It is underemphasized in the report. What the report does highlight seems inconsistent with an upgrade, especially merely 4 convictions for labor trafficking or passport retention. And screening mechanisms to identify and assist trafficking victims are truly thin. By comparison, The State Department sustained a Tier 3 ranking for Thailand because of things like victim protection remaining insufficient in its massive sex industry, in fishing and seafood, and in Thai citizens migrating to work elsewhere. I will repeat, as you noted, I believe that the upgrade of Vietnam to Tier 2 is bewildering, especially with the utter absence of prosecutions for labor trafficking and significant official complicity. Uzbekistan being upgraded to the Tier 2 watch list is striking. The report notes that child labor mobilization continues in some districts of the country, and, quote, government-compelled forced labor of adults remained endemic in the 2014 cotton harvest. This is one of the most heinous human rights abusers in the world, even among those countries that Freedom House rates as not free. As far as Cuba's upgrade to Tier 2 watch list, well, Freedom House ranks Cuba as clearly not free. The grounds for an upgrade are really questionable. The report itself says the penal code does not criminalize all forms of human trafficking, much less are those problems a matter of enforcement, and the Cuban regime did not even claim efforts to prevent forced labor or any trafficking-specific shelters. So, with cases like cases like Cuba and Malaysia sparking observers to suggest the report is politicized, what are we to make of this? To say that no considerations besides the pure merits of human trafficking come into play in the department is a bit like the claim of being shocked to find gambling going on at Rick's Joint in Casablanca. It shouldn't surprise us. But what should be done to protect, to maximize the integrity of the TIP report rankings? Some steps we could take would make the malady that you've been looking at in this hearing worse. A few years ago, a senator on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, no longer there, concerned that Singapore and Malaysia were getting rather low rankings considering U.S. economic and strategic interests, proposed legislation to markedly increase the role of the regional bureaus. That was a lousy idea, in short. In the early life of the TIP office, former Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage, who no one could call a human rights idealist, came to the decision that the pen for the draft of the report and the proposed rankings should lie with the Office on Trafficking in Persons. That needs to be protected. The most productive solution is for Congress to insist in its oversight role and the Senate in focusing on appointments that the ambassador's position is filled, and it's filled with someone with strong experience, vision, and bureaucratic chops, because there is bureaucratic infighting, as your hearing has focused on. Delays nominating and confirming an envoy lead to more disputed rankings, ending up rejecting the substantive expertise and recommendation of the TIP office. And I'm really troubled how long it took to replace Ambassador Luis C. de Baca. A fellow human rights advocate in the area of women's rights, who I won't name out of respect for her, with deep experience in both civil society partnerships and multilateral institutions, was rejected as a finalist, as I understand it, because she was apparently too concerned about the commoditization of females for sex trafficking. I've said here before you, when you've been kind enough to invite me to testify, we need a strong advocate for fighting both labor and sex trafficking. It's crucial. How can we best protect the strength and integrity of the report? Congress should insist that the leader of the office be someone who themselves reflects strength and integrity. There's going to be a deliberative process in the department. We know it. But it'll be much more likely to produce credible rankings that maximize the United States diplomatic leverage to get countries to pass better laws and, more importantly, to implement them if there is a strong leader of the office. Then there'll be fewer calls like Malaysia compared to Thailand. So thank you for inviting me, as ever, to testify. This is an issue in which dignity or enslavement lie in the balance.
Ambassador Legon, thank you so much for your testimony, for your lifelong commitment to human rights. And when you served as ambassador, you were absolutely candid, both on the record as well as off, and I think that made an enormous difference. I remember it was you who finally, despite the China hands who didn't want, I'm sure, you to do it, pointed out the nexus between the coercive population control program of the PRC and the consequence of particularly sex trafficking because of the missing daughters in the People's Republic of China as a result of sex-selected abortion. And you made that very clear. Your comments on Uzbekistan, I think, were, and I did ask that question based on your testimony, and I thank you for it. Maybe you could provide us some additional, I would agree with you that, when we originally did this law, the absolute intent was trafficking and only trafficking goes into the book. We want an honest assessment of friend and ally and foe alike, I should say, allies and around the world. No games, no brinksmanship. Again, as I have cited many times, the fact that Israel and South Korea during the previous administration's watch were singled out. There was shock and dismay, frankly, among many quarters. But it actually led to an amelioration of the issue. Victims were protected and prevention strategies put into place, and now South Korea has very, very strong laws, as does the State of Israel. We should never pull our punches, and you have made that clear. And I want to thank you because during your tenure, you were always available to this subcommittee and to other members of Congress, House and Senate, and you were always candid, and that's beyond refreshing. Let me also say, any suggestions you have about strengthening the tip office would be appreciated from you and personally and from Freedom House. One of the reasons, and you point out in your testimony, your written testimony, that the last trafficking reauthorization may have inadvertently increased the role of the regional bureaus. I believe that as well, reading the language. It was not my bill. It was an amendment attached to the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, which I strongly support. But I ended up voting against the reauthorization of my own law that was proffered by Senator Leahy, simply because it weakened the tip office vis-a-vis the bureaus. If they have input, it ought to be to say, thank you for doing your due diligence, and we accept it because you are the experts. And then the second part of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the sanctions portion, was always left to tip all kinds of collaboration, but the belief was that reasonable men and women would look at how we can best advance the ball and protect victims and mitigate trafficking in the first place, which is you make decisions. It's not based on empirical data, how many convictions, what is country X, Y, or Z doing. And the book, the TIP report, was always meant to be to just say it in an unvarnished way. And so the disappointment that I and so many others feel about the artificial upgrades to Malaysia, to Vietnam, to China, Uzbekistan, where we're, as you have been dogged in pointing out, and you did in one previous appearance here, the comparisons to the cotton that was picked by slaves. You put it in that context, and lights went off. Yeah, that's what many of the slaves did in the United States, and they're doing it in Uzbekistan. So any particular thoughts you might have on, in addition to what you've already said, would be helpful. Your testimony notes that Vietnam does not prosecute labor trafficking at all, and that there is a high level of official complicity in labor trafficking. Again, that raises questions about a favored country where there are other things on the table other than trafficking, and they ought to be, in my opinion, a Tier 3 country as well. So perhaps you can spend some time on those questions.
Much to address, and I thank you. Look, let me note three things. First of all, you've played a role in focusing on the question of official complicity. When a diplomat is involved in subjecting a domestic servant to human trafficking conditions, that should be seriously held to account in the report. You have raised the issue of peacekeepers of nations who have in fact added to human suffering in places that they've served, from the Balkans to places in Africa, as opposed to relieving it, complicit as agents of their government. I think, especially in a case where a government policy is in fact the source of human trafficking. This is the stunning thing about Uzbekistan. Sure, it's finally agreed to let the ILO come in and start looking at the problem of child labor. Okay, that's good. But if, in fact, it is a policy of the government to continue forced labor for adults, and it's not eliminating entirely the phenomenon of child labor, that's a special category. I can't see how you could give an upgrade from Tier 3 for that. And I think that's something that's worth really driving home. If the government itself is doing it, or its officials are complicit, that should be reported. In fact, it's my view that if officials of a government are involved, such as their diplomats, that should be mentioned in the report, maybe not the names of the officials. It's been long, secondly, my view that both the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, with due respect to you as its author, and the Palermo Protocol are heavily focused on the prosecution and law enforcement precepts. There are more things in the minimum standards there. I think it's very important that you see progress across the so-called 3 Ps. And in particular, I've been consistent in saying that the moral imperative lies with the protection of victims, or what I would call the re-empowerment of the survivors. I think if there's anything one does to look at revision of the legislation, is to make sure that you are not giving an upgrade and failing to take account of an anemic record on victim protection. And I think in some of the cases in question here in East Asia with Malaysia and Vietnam, that's the case. The last thing I would say is that any fix in the process in wanting to protect the degree to which the pen is held by the tip office, you shouldn't seek a zero role for the regional bureaus or zero role for the embassies. They do raise considerations that should be looked at. I remember people from the South and Central Asia Bureau who had very different views from me as the tip ambassador on many countries, saying, so can we say that Sri Lanka has the capacity to take steps on fighting human trafficking when it's been facing an internal conflict? Those sorts of questions should be raised. What's inappropriate is if there's a tier upgrade based on issues that have nothing to do with human trafficking.
As I mentioned to her, is there anything that you heard in testimony by our 3 previous witnesses that you would like to respond to?
Well, I think it's an interesting argument with regard to Cuba that by our having more dialogue with Cuba, we found out more. I mean, this was always an issue with North Korea, Iran, and Cuba. We don't have diplomatic relations with those countries, so they're not about to hand over the statistics that we ask of host governments through our embassies. I think it is a more credible argument that Cuba has may have taken some steps following ratification of the Palermo Protocol than to suggest, well, now we know more because we're in dialogue with them. I still find it kind of far-fetched that what remains one of the Marxist-Leninist governments of the world does not have a problem with its state enterprises or its political prisons of forced labor. With regard to Malaysia, I heard nothing in the testimony that would lead me to believe that the tip office did not, as Reuters reported it, recommend a Tier 3 ranking. One cannot take the evidence raised for the upgrade and see it as a tangible reason for this. I will say I am sympathetic to the position that Dr. Johnstone is in, and I would caution that we can explore what happened, what went awry here, but ultimately, if you want to keep pressure on other governments, maybe it isn't best for the specific different recommendations of the tip office and regional bureaus, whoever wins out, to be known globally. In general, the vast majority of cases do come out where they ought to be and where the tip office recommends. Some are howlers, as I described to the press in this report, as mistakes. But I think we should take care about revealing that there were different opinions too much, because after all, the bill that you helped make a law and the office that you helped create puts its pressure on by a kind of credible, focused leverage on other nations.
I agree with that, but we still have to get it right for that credibility to be warranted.
Sure.
And let me just ask you about India, and that's a country that we have focused on in this committee on a number of fronts when it comes to human rights, from religious freedom, or the lack of it, the issue of abducted children, and the new Sean and David Goldman International Child Abduction Prevention and Return Act makes it very clear that India has a serious problem with parental child abduction. And the Tier 2 ranking for India doesn't appear to be deserved at all. And I would really appreciate your thoughts on that. India has a huge child sex trafficking problem. Other kinds of trafficking as well, but it's huge. And I'm not sure we get the kind of data back from the government,
right,
their government, that would warrant such a designation.
I agree with you entirely. I think that the Tier 2 ranking is suspect. You may have noticed in part of my written testimony that I didn't deliver orally that we should take care. There are some very serious human rights issues or serious global issues that aren't precisely human trafficking. They should raise doubts about a country's overall human rights record. And that's true of India as well. You have been at the heart of every reauthorization of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. The only place in the legislation where the scale of the problem is mentioned is in the Tier 2 watch list. That's the one place where there could be a justification for a nation not being on Tier 2, but being on the Tier 2 watch list, because the scale is so large. And it's true in India. It remains the demographic epicenter of human trafficking in the world. And while there have been improvements that might merit India no longer being on, a country that anyone, that the tip office would propose be Tier 3, because of finally some actions in the states and the federal system in India, the scale is so large and the implementation so spotty that it is really hard to suggest that Tier 2 is merited.
Ask you one final question, and then any concluding comments you might want to make. Last week, I chaired a hearing on the Commission on Security Cooperation in Europe on the Syrian refugees. And one of our witnesses was the regional representative for the UNHCR. His name is Pitterman. And he said that the trigger for this massive move into Europe was a 30% cut in World Food Program funding. People are so desperate now for such basics as food that they finally gave flight, and now they're moving in large numbers. We're talking about 7.5 million IDPs, 4 million refugees who are scattered everywhere. Are you convinced, and I should have asked this of the previous panel as well, that the concerns of trafficking in persons are being integrated into our efforts to assist refugees, particularly in that part of the world?
Well, I'm very glad you asked that for multiple reasons. One, I noticed that former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and former Ambassador at Large C. DeBaca emphasized that we need to look at humanitarian situations and refugee situations and worry about the impact on human trafficking. At least on a thought leader level, they were focused on that earlier in this administration. I don't think we're doing enough with respect to the refugees. There's clearly a vulnerability for human trafficking with the enormous desperation. Those who are seeking a better life when they're in hardship are ones who are going to be vulnerable. I will say two things, however. We should not, as I say in my written testimony, forget the heart of human trafficking being exploitation rather than the movement of people. I noticed earlier that people suddenly discovered a human trafficking problem with Haiti when there was natural disaster. There'd been a human trafficking problem with Haiti with the rest of X for a long time, and so too we should not discover a human trafficking problem when there have been some endemic problems. But I must say, with my Freedom House hat on, the situation here is a governance problem. This is a human rights calamity that has been left to fester in Syria. It is amazing how the United States and the West has not taken action to deal with the cause of the problem, which is the mass atrocities from Assad. And these predated the atrocities of ISIS, which only make the situation worse and hence create a human trafficking vulnerability.
Mr. Lagon, thank you so very much for your testimony. And without objection, your full written statement will be made part of the record.
Thank you very much.
And please continue to provide counsel insight to the committee as you have done so effectively for many, many years.
Well, as a former Capitol Hill staffer who was around at the time of the conference on the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, I consider myself, honorary Hill staffer, so I always will think about how the oversight and the further refinement of the legislation are things I could play my small part in helping on. Thank you for your leadership.
Make that large part. And thank you so very much, Mr. Ambassador. The hearing is adjourned.